Thank you, Tigran. Thank you for organizing this conference. Thank you for inviting me. Really enjoying it. And thanks to Bob, Stefan, and Catherine for their wonderful presentations in the morning. So I'm going to talk about front stage, backstage, Las Vegas, and relationality in urbanism. I'm going to explain that a little bit as we go along. Before we start, I want to dedicate this presentation to my mother, who I lost just a few weeks ago. She passed away. So this is not so much in mourning, but to celebrate her life. That's a wonderful photograph of her, full of life. So why Las Vegas? And we've had people explain. I'll tell you why I chose Las Vegas. This is part of a book project I'm working on. Like Stefan's book, it's got several chapters, and this is one of them. And when you hear Las Vegas, and we've talked about this, most people think of the Strip, which is one street. And a lot of the discussion, not by the people in this room, but others when I started doing research, is about, how Las Vegas is fake. Las Vegas is spectacle. Las Vegas is transient. And for about 50 years, it's the same cliches over and over again. And Las Vegas as a city, like any city, is actually much more complex than that. In fact, even if you look at the Strip, it's much more complex. So this is the view of the Mirage Hotel, Casino, and Resort. This is the Strip. People are walking along. That's the waterfall and the volcano that erupts at night. But if you look closely, there are these protesters protesting because the Mirage has a tank full of dolphins in the middle of a desert. Something's not right about that. So even on the Strip, actually, it's a lot of interesting things are happening if you look closely. If you go beyond the cliches of spectacle and fake and everything that most people, even urban scholars, write about. It's not just popular perception, but they write about that. But there was something more. So one thing I'm saying is that I want to understand the complexity of Las Vegas. The second thing is, this is also, I wanted to critique critical theory, which tends to have very simplistic theories about cities, what explains cities. So critical theory usually blames everything on capitalism or neoliberalism, which is part of it. What
This
happened?
is disruptive theory. Or disruptive
Are
practice.
you going to watch the explosion again on video, just to kind of drive home the point? All right, while he's doing that, just in the interest of time. So this slide you see of direct observation at the Bellagio, I wanted to understand, how many of you have been to Las Vegas, by the way? Oh, about a third of the room. So have you been to the Bellagio? A few of you. One of the things I just find it fascinating. I don't love Las Vegas. I don't hate Las Vegas. I want to study and understand it. So it's a very fascinating city. And one of the things that happened when I go to the Bellagio, like I took this photograph. If you stand in the lobby of the Bellagio, first of all, first thing you notice, there are thousands of people who come and go, like any big casino. But the other thing you notice, if you look closely enough, it is impeccably clean. Weirdly, strangely clean. You're like, 1,000 people come and go, but it's clean, it's shiny all the time. So the next question you ask yourself is, who's cleaning this all the time? How are these casinos being run? Who's cleaning them? Who are the security guards? Who are the gardeners? Who are the people who make it run, essentially? And so, of course, if you look closely enough, you see in the background, somebody's cleaning, somebody's mopping, but always in the background. And the next question is, where do they live? How do they come to the casino? They don't come through the front door. What is their transportation? What is their housing like? What are the neighborhoods like? So essentially, it's about the relationship between the Strip and the neighborhoods. So yes, Las Vegas has residents, but it's not enough to say residents. What are they like? What is their experience of Las Vegas? So I came up with this metaphor. First of all, Las Vegas is much more interesting than its stereotypes. It's a city of extremes. Yes, it is a city of extremes. But even a city of extremes kind of reveals very clearly things that happen in other cities, as several of the speakers have mentioned this morning. And it has implications for the true nature of contemporary urbanism. So I'm saying not only is it like similar to other cities in ways we may not think about, but actually, if you do the right kind of analysis, not a superficial analysis. It reveals a lot about how the 20th, late 20th, early 21st century city is actually produced. So in this, I'm using a metaphor, and this is a little tricky. I'd like you to keep that in mind, because when I say metaphor, people take it literally, like, where's the front stage, where's the backstage? No, it's a metaphor for how the city is organized. And the metaphor is, of course, the city as theater with the front stage and backstage, in which the front stage, which are parts of the city that are lavished with attention and resources. So the obvious example in Las Vegas, I would say it's not just the strips, because there are other casinos and resorts all over Las Vegas. There are convention centers, as Stefan mentioned. And then the backstage, metaphorical backstage, would be where the people live and where they, etc., serves the front stage and is relatively invisible. Now keep that metaphor in mind, because I think it applies to almost any major city in the world. It may not be casinos, etc., but I'll show you one example to help you think this through. So in the previous slide, the top kind of collage shows kind of what the front stage might look like. Of course, it's hotel, casinos, the Las Vegas sign, and so forth. On the bottom is the backstage, where people live, very modest, usually low income, etc., community center, and so forth. But in thinking this through, I realized they're actually intertwined. These are not separate areas. Just like in the theater, the front stage and backstage are intimately connected spatially and otherwise. So this notion of the metaphor, this is something I've been really thinking about as an analytical device, not just to describe a city, but to analyze and understand what's going on. It's a figure of speech that is emblematic of something else. And in terms of analysis, it helps reveal hidden qualities and commonalities of cities. So when Shakespeare wrote this famous quote that a lot of people say, all the world's a stage, he did not mean literally. Right? I mean, that's something I think we have to grapple with, metaphor versus literal. So what are the implications of this front stage, backstage relationship? One is, as I sort of hint at in the collage, it's not a simple dichotomy. It's not front stage versus backstage. It's actually a symbiotic relationship, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And so Las Vegas becomes a site for investigating this relationship in urbanism. And obviously, these are not equal relationships. In any major city, including Stockholm or Las Vegas, there's certain parts of the city that receive more resources, more attention, more visitors, and other parts of the city which don't. It's not that complicated, but that is the nature of this relationship. So it's an uneven relationship. So here is an aerial photograph of Las Vegas. This diagonal line is the strip in the middle. And did you know that the Las Vegas Strip is not in the city of Las Vegas? How many of you know that? Okay, how many of you know which city it is in? What's the name of the city it's in? Yeah. Paradise. Paradise is a made-up city. Paradise, the Las Vegas Strip is in the city of Paradise, which is a made-up city in Clark County for political and economic reasons. So when people say, oh, it's the main street of Las Vegas, it is not. It is in the Las Vegas metropolitan region. And I think all of us, when we say the city of Las Vegas, we mean the metropolitan region. But technically, the city of Las Vegas, I mean, the project I'm going to show you is the border of the city of Las Vegas. Right? So already beginning to understand, it's actually more complex. Whether it's Stockholm or Las Vegas, cities are actually much more complex than we make them out to be. So the front stage, backstage relationship that I'm going to investigate in Las Vegas is through these two projects. The Stratosphere Hotel and Casino, which has been mentioned this morning, and a neighborhood that the city calls the Gateway District. So there's the Gateway District in red, that's the neighborhood. And the bottom of that is the southern edge of the city of Las Vegas. That's where the city of Las Vegas ends, and you see how the strip continues much further down from that. So that's the neighborhood where people live and do everything that ordinary people do. a shop, there's a community center, there's parks, things like that. And then in the kind of deep red is the stratosphere, hotel, casino, and resort. This is something I've learned that Stefan explained very well. It's never a casino, it's always hotel, casino, and resort. There's a lot more going on than we think. All right, so the front stage is this building that some of you might have seen, the Stratosphere, tallest building in Las Vegas, 80,000 square feet, 2,400 rooms, which by Las Vegas standards is kind of middle. Now it's 5,000 rooms are the big hotels. Tower is more than 1,000 feet. It was completed about 20 years ago in 1996. Here's the backstage. This is what it looks like, the neighborhood called the Gateway District. Also known as Naked City, which I won't get into, but there's a lot of mythologizing. There's a lot of stories we tell about cities, about neighborhoods, about projects that over time become true because we keep repeating the same stories. And Naked City is one example. I'll tell you very quickly, the name Naked City came because supposedly, and I don't believe it at all, everybody says it, but I don't think it's true. In the 1950s, showgirls would sunbathe either topless or nude. Just think about that. First of all, it's an incredibly sexist way of referring to an entire neighborhood on supposedly naked or half-naked women, not men, right? Secondly, I did my research because, again, I'm very interested in how we label things, how we understand things. I did not find any historical evidence about it. It's just people keep repeating the story, even now, 50 years later, without any evidence. So I don't know, I don't like that name because it also has a very derogatory connotation to it. Whenever we say naked city, it's never a good thing. So land was first plotted in 1905, which is the year Las Vegas became a city. First houses from 1930s. Now it's mostly low income and immigrant residents. Most of them are Hispanic. So let me explain this notion of front stage, backstage, and the symbiotic relationship between the two. So I said it's not a simple dichotomy of front versus back. Symbiotic or symbiosis means relationships of mutual dependence. So one would think that the backstage, where a lot of low-income families live, need the front stage for jobs, etc. No, it's actually, it works both ways. The front stage, which is hotels, casinos, and resorts, also need those people to, as employees, to run these places, like my Bellagio example, to clean the place, to clean the hotel rooms, to be security guards, to be gardeners, to be waiters, to be cooks, and it goes on and on. So it is mutually dependent, though not necessarily mutually beneficial. And I'm going to go through this in three ways. I'm going to explore these symbiotic relationships through the social construction of narratives, which I've hinted at, kind of stories which are not just stories, but really influence design and policy. Specialities of distant proximity, for those of you who are urbanists might understand, is that even if something is next to each other, they're spatially proximate, they're actually distant. Something can be next to it physically, but actually in experience and reality is very distant. And the third is Project Savior syndrome. Those of you who are trained as architects will be very familiar, which is basically build it and they will come. Somehow magically you build a stadium, it will transform the neighborhood. And the best example of this is something called the Bilbao effect. How many of you know about the Bilbao effect? Great. So those of you who don't know, Bilbao is a city in Spain, and they built a Guggenheim Museum, which was a kind of franchise of the Guggenheim in New York, designed by Frank Gehry. And the story goes that this museum by itself magically transformed the city. Now you might think that's silly, but there's thousands and thousands of people who believe it. And that is called Project Savior syndrome. You build something and somehow it transforms the neighborhood or the city. So we're going to look at that. Is that true or not? All right, so let me start with the social construct of narratives. So this is the neighborhood. I showed you another slide. You're beginning to get a hint of what kind of narratives exist about this neighborhood through this photograph. There's a fence. That's a swimming pool, which is not used anymore, so it's filled in. And so this is an area which is, sick, blighted, decay. Conventional policies and practices tend to view certain areas as sick and in need of healing intervention. So experts can come in and fix things. So here's a direct quote about how this neighborhood, Gateway District, has been infested with drug dealers and plagued with crime, including murders, drive-by shootings, and other violent crimes. So if you were to read this and believe it, like it must be a horrible place where nobody lives, but actually life goes on. So this is the entrance, main entrance from the strip to the casino on the left, and on the right is the tower building. So for those of you who've been to Las Vegas, in these casinos, where do most of the people enter from? From the strip or somewhere else? From the parking. So this is only like the rich people in limousines and taxis and things like that. But the vast majority of people actually enter from the back, which are these horrible parking garages, etc. So I mean, this again, things never appear. They are never what they seem to be. But this is the front. This is supposedly, but you can see there's hardly anybody walking in from there. So these, I mentioned in the previous one, these kind of sick areas need healing interventions from experts. In this case, healing interventions are often in the guise of privately funded, publicly supported projects used as beacons of progress, as was the case here. So this is again a quote, that mighty tower shines like a beacon of progress to the residents. We plunked down a $500 million project in the middle of one of the worst neighborhoods. So you're seeing this social constructive narratives. This project will come and save this horrible neighborhood. The fastest way to fix a blighted area is through capital investment. Serious studies haven't actually proven that, but again, this is people keep repeating and they believe, yeah, you plop down a huge tower, suddenly magically everything is fixed. So what are the implications of these kinds of narratives? So again, these narratives or stories are not just things we say, but they're used to justify projects such as the stratosphere and policies such as the Weed and Seed program, which was a very big program in the US, which I'll explain a little bit. It was started in the 1990s, and weed means weeding. You take out criminal activities and criminals, and seeding, you plant seeds, implementing programs that are designed and administered by a combination of state, local, and community level actors. All right, so somebody mentioned Hal Rothman this morning. I think it was Stefan who mentioned Hal Rothman. Did you mention Hal Rothman? Yeah. Who's like a very famous historian of Las Vegas. He and Mike Davis wrote this book, and they specifically talk about the stratosphere, and they call this a Darwinian economy, where the forces of economic marginalization and urban redevelopment have united. It's a little extreme, but there's something there. In a sinister compact to displace some of the strip's poorest residents. So these projects don't just happen, they happen at a cost. This land is not just sitting there empty, there's something there beforehand. In this case, yes, there were houses there, and people were evicted and moved out. So this is the main point about narratives. Narratives often become indistinguishable from the basic empirical identities of buildings, neighborhoods, and entire cities. So narratives are not just words and kind of rhetoric, kind of academic discussion. They have real power to them and real effect on the ground. All right, so that was the social construct of narratives. The second part is the specialities of distant proximity. Now this is starting to give a hint of that. I took this photograph from the top of the Stratosphere Tower. You're looking down, and here is the parking garage. Here is the hotel, and the casino is here, and there's the neighborhood. You see literally the shadow of the tower cast on the neighborhood. What does this configuration remind you of as a building type? Sorry? Panopticon. What else? Yeah, essentially it's a panopticon and fortress, right? So already it's right next to the neighborhood, but the signal it's sending is we need to be protected from you people, who are barely surviving. But this is an example of, specialities of distant proximity can be done through urban form and space. Even though on plan it looks like it's next to each other. So this experience of these specialities that matter, not what's just in the aerial photograph or the plan. And it continues. So there's this quote, this wonderful quote, where they interviewed a real estate broker who has been working in this area for a long time. And she says they could build nice apartments, but they're still going to have to worry about people looking down at basically trash. What do you think trash means? Yeah, I don't think she means literally trash. She means people, right? So, you're beginning to see how these specialities of distant proximity are reinforced, one, through urban form and space, but also through the first weapon, which was narratives. This is garbage, this is blight, this is just get rid of them. Okay, so this is the parking garage that you saw the aerial photograph of, and on the left is the neighborhood. So this is what people living in the neighborhood see every day. They don't see the front entrance and everything else that's in the publicity photographs. Did you change the battery on this? It's really... Okay. So these specialities of distant proximity are created through urban form and space, but also through actions and attitudes. What does that mean? So here's an example. Okay, this is not working. It's okay. So here's a quote from the former CEO of the Stratosphere, that he and his vice presidents personally went out to the area and hauled away trash, raked yards, and gave away food to residents. He said that the Stratosphere has tried to be good corporate citizens, but we can't do it alone, especially with the issue of crime. They're now being, the CEO and his vice presidents are now being nominated as saints because they've gone out and cleaned the trash. They're such good people. But we cannot fix it. So there's a kind of, again, a distance created that it's their problems. We can clean the trash, but we can't solve their problems. So this is how these relationships are created. So I already said this, that a distance was created through the series of public and private actions, as well as the social construction of narratives. So this is when, in order to create the Stratosphere and the parking garage, as you can see, it's a very large complex. A public agency, the Las Vegas Redevelopment Authority, used eminent domain to evict residents, and part of it was for this huge garage of 4,500 cars. Each of the families were given about $5,000. This is in the 1990s, early 1990s, to cover expenses of moving, and within 30 days end up finding a place to live. So it's basically a public agency which is supposed to represent everybody. That's the whole idea. Government is supposed to be for all citizens, not some citizens and not other citizens, but then who decided to do this on behalf of a private corporation. And usually they justify it by saying it's because we are creating jobs. So while these kind of us versus them narratives get built up through the ways I've just shown, the residents, I mean, life goes on. It's not like they're not doing nothing. They have jobs, they're trying to. So this is just a quick description. Now, I've walked around this neighborhood quite a bit. I've never been mugged, I've never been shot. There's life goes on, and yeah, they are struggling. But so they play slot machines at the store, they sit in the front lawns, they gather in front of the community center. The community center is amazing. It does incredible things like it has language programs, skills courses, dance, volleyball, basketball. Kids are fed after school. There's a computer lab. There's a library. So there's a kind of life to it. While the popular discourse and public discourse is about blight and decay, there's kind of life goes on. It's not an easy life, but it goes on. All right, so the third part I'm going to talk about is Project Savior Syndrome. So this is, you see, the photograph that I took from the neighborhood looking back at this looming tower, and you see the relationship between the two types of architecture. So Project Savior Syndrome is essentially what I might call, for lack of a better term, kind of an architectural approach to urbanism, where a singular project, like the Guggenheim Museum or the Stratosphere, somehow save an entire area or a city. And sometimes it's made explicit, sometimes it's not. And this is how it's justified. The Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Empire State Building in New York, the tower is going to be in Las Vegas. We never had a symbol. So even though it's a private building, it's seen as a public monument that will symbolize Las Vegas, which didn't quite happen. This is the employee entrance of the Stratosphere. So one of the things I look at is I don't really buy sometimes, my colleagues on the left construct this narrative of the helpless victims and the evil, corporations. Well, in a way, sort of everybody's complicit. And one of the reasons this Project Savior Syndrome is so pervasive is a lot of people buy into it. Even residents think having this casino will somehow improve their neighborhood. And this comes from I think a kind of belief in what I call economic developmentalism, that somehow economic development, even if it's a big corporation, big project, big hotel, will somehow filter down to people, and it's not really thought through how that's going to happen, kind of, trickle-down economics. So here's an interview with a resident who basically said that, the Stratosphere should help clean up the area, if not for the community, but also for the employees. So, right, again, belief that this is a good thing. The project can do good things for the area. So it's not only just an architectural object, an object-oriented, project-oriented approach to urbanism, but also one-off gestures of goodwill, which I think uniquely American. I've not seen it in any other country, where they give away money, give away gifts, like around, well, I'll give you the example here. So these are kinds of gifts they gave. So $100,000 to renovate community center, $300,000 over 5 years to the city for affordable housing, 15% of new hires at Stratosphere meant for Gateway District, and gifts to neighborhoods for Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. Now, as a researcher, it's your job to see, does it actually work? Not just follow the claims. So yes, they did hand over the community center, and they donated $100,000. $300,000 over 5 years is how much? $1,500,000, which is a drop in the bucket of affordable housing in Las Vegas. This one, 15% of new jobs at the Stratosphere are meant for people in the area. I could not find any evidence of either it being monitored or actually being followed through. So it may have happened, I doubt it, because how would you know unless it was being kept track of? And this is very common in the US. I don't know if it's common in Europe. They just give gifts over Thanksgiving, like toys for the kids, which is very nice, but I don't think it helps them eat or whatever, get them a second job. It amazes me, like when I lived in the US, that, this, what is it? Toys for Tots. The Marines come out and give these stuffed animals made by slave labor in China. That's somehow going to make them happy. Good for them. So this is the main problem of this kind of thinking. Yes, we do need projects, we do need jobs, we do need to build things like housing and other things. But this approach rarely addresses deeper structural and systemic challenges, such as a lack of decent affordable housing, which is a very big crisis, I would say, in most cities. I've not done a study, but I guarantee you it's a major problem in Stockholm. For those of you who are students, I bet you're not living in very nice housing. Maybe the rich students are. I hope I didn't offend anybody, but I bet you there's an affordable housing crisis in Stockholm, like most cities around the world, but it's more systemic. You cannot just build an apartment building here, apartment building there, and think you've kind of addressed it. It's kind of drops in the ocean. Of course, again, you do need to build housing, you do need projects, but you need something more. This is a stunning quote from the former mayor of Las Vegas, Oscar Goodman, and he's talking about this area, and he talks about eminent domain, where people are being evicted from this area to make room for the Stratosphere and its huge parking garage. And he says, he's lying, of course. How do I know he's lying? Those are not the facts. Properties aren't being condemned for redevelopment purposes because living conditions have become so aberrant, it's the only remedy. Just think about it for a second. So the only way to solve poor living conditions is to push people out of the neighborhood and demolish their homes. And then look at the second part of his quote. They do work, but for them to find affordable housing is going to be a challenge. I don't have the answer. So he has the answer about evicting and demolishing, but not what will replace it. All right. And those of you who know Las Vegas, Oscar Goodman was very famous for being the lawyer for the mafia. Only in Las Vegas, not only in Las Vegas. There are many cities where people who have criminal affiliations become political leaders. But you begin to see his thinking. And by the way, now his wife is the mayor. Quickly moving on before we all get depressed. Okay. So now I'm going to show how this is not really, I was joking, it's not only in Las Vegas, but how this kind of thing happens in different cities, the front stage, backstage, symbiotic relationship. So I'm going to show you just one more US cities, but I think there are other cities in the world where this applies. So this is Atlanta, Georgia, where in 1996 they had the Olympic Games, and the neighborhood next to it is called the Summerhill neighborhood. So this is a stadium. It's not a hotel, it's not a casino, it's not a resort. So here's the neighborhood. As you can tell, that's downtown, right below where the name Atlanta is. The red area is the Summerhill neighborhood. And the stadium that was built for the Olympics is right in it, similar to Stratosphere and Gateway District. Here's the stadium. Does anybody notice a strange design of the stadium? Something strange about the design? Yes, you were saying something with your hands? Huh? Oh yeah, why do you think it's zigzagging? Let's see how many good architects we have in the room. They had this very interesting idea that after the Olympic Games, part of the stadium will be demolished and the rest of it will be used as a baseball stadium. So the part that's crooked, kind of this weird thing, becomes the baseball stadium here, and that gets demolished. Kind of interesting idea. They actually used that idea in the Olympic Games in London, where the stadiums were built temporarily to accommodate the thousands of spectators, and then they removed the kind of temporary stands, etc. So interesting idea. So capacity was 83,000. It was cost $209 million at that time. Around the same time, 1996, same time as Stratosphere and Gateway District. Part of a $2 billion investment used for opening and closing ceremonies and track and field events. So that's it's called the Centennial Olympic Stadium. Now this is the neighborhood. It gives you a flavor for it. Again, like the first photograph I showed you of the Gateway District, it's not as bad as, yeah, it has problems. It's not perfect, but it's not as bad as sometimes people make it out to be. That's always an interesting sign, at least in the US, when people park their car on the grass. I'm not sure a sign of what. Maybe Bob can tell us later. Maybe I'm indulging in stereotypes, but it means they don't have a garage or driveway. That's what it means. I could say more, but I won't. So this was one of the first African-American neighborhoods after the US Civil War, which was in the 19th century. The population has shrunk from 20,000 peak in the 1950s to 2,500 around the time of the Olympics. And so there was this part of the Olympic ring neighborhoods around the stadium where people are quite low income. And this neighborhood was selected for about $2 million worth of investment. So yeah, so there was a plan to invest in the neighborhood. So, social construction of narratives. I'm going to take you through the 3 parts that I did in Las Vegas. This is a stadium, as you see during one of the track and field events, full of people, a lot of excitement, of course. And as has become quite commonplace now, almost every Olympic Games, Rio, London, and on, have this goal, is to put the city on the map and mostly to bring more long-term investments and revenues, which sort of makes sense. So in Atlanta specifically, this phrase, you probably hear quite a lot about cities, the notion of the world-class city. And there's a lot of debate, what the hell is a world-class city? There's obviously different definitions of that, but that was one of their goals. To redevelop it, to put it on the map as a tourist destination. Atlanta is not really considered, or was not considered, such a big tourist destination at that time. But also, as you see in the last sentence, as an opportunity to revive the inner city areas and draw a different kind of suburbanite to the downtown area. That's a key phrase. That's often a strategy for reviving low-income, sort of blighted neighborhoods to bring people, either tourists or people from the suburbs. So that was a clear goal of this project. Here's a view of the area, Summerhill. So similar to Gateway District, it was seen as crime-ridden, dangerous, and undesirable, and as places of opportunity to bring in a different type of population. So CODA is the corporation which is in charge of development of the Olympics. They had problems because they could not find funding for the large-scale developments originally envisioned. And basically they were looking for private funding. And the problem was this perception of crime, poor schools, and how would people from the suburbs or middle-income families want to live there if there are all these problems. So that became a big challenge. But here again, you begin to see this social construction of narratives about the project, the stadium versus the neighborhood. Okay, so second is specialities of distant proximity. So what has happened is it has resulted in aggressive displacement of many homeless and poor residents, like in Las Vegas. And one of the ways, and this is very interesting, I think it's a very interesting thing, a lot of these ideas come from empirical evidence. When you do research, you look at theory, look at literature, you look at what other people have written, but you also look at the evidence in front of you and what it shows. So what this shows is the different ways in which parts of the city which are literally next to each other are kind of, stretched apart, create barriers and distances. So here, this is different from Las Vegas. What created these specialities of distant proximity are laws and regulations. So a few years before the Olympics in 1991, it criminalized a wide range of common survival strategies of people living in poverty. Aggressive panhandling, loitering. I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago. Loitering in other parts of the world is called hanging out. Like especially in the global south where it's warmer, people hang out in front of their stoops, what Jane Jacobs loves to say, but it's criminalized behavior in a lot of cities. So here was specifically to kind of target these neighborhoods. Camping in public, remaining in a parking lot without having a car parked there. Can you imagine that? That's a crime. If you hang out in a parking lot where you don't have a car, you can get arrested. Being in an abandoned building, washing a car windshield, urinating in public, and generally acting in a manner not worthy of a law-abiding citizen. So that's how these distances were created. And there was redevelopment, so the $2 million I mentioned, it turned out to be mostly beautification and rarely benefited local residents. So they did do new housing, some new housing, townhouses, single-family houses, but it was financially out of reach of the residents who were displaced because they were designed to attract, as you saw in the previous slide, people from the suburbs or middle-income families. And finally, the third aspect of the symbiotic relationship between front stage and backstage is the Project Savior syndrome. As you can see, it's quite a spectacular stadium. That the one in the background is an existing stadium, and then in the upper right is downtown Atlanta. But you get a kind of a flavor for the area around it, lots of parking lots, highways, and so forth. So they were supposed to address problems of so-called decay and blight in the inner city area. And so they heard all the residents, a lot of people gave promises of solving a range of social problems, homelessness, crime, poverty, drug abuse, and teen pregnancy as a result of these projects. So, what does that mean? What this means is this front stage, backstage metaphor exists in most US and I would say even other parts of the world, but operates differently in each one, right? So I think you have to be very careful not to apply it literally, but see how it operates. Like I'm 100% sure it operates in Stockholm. So here's a quote from Norman Krumholtz, a very well-known planner and author in the US. And he lists a number of these kinds of projects: Harbor Place in Baltimore, Quincy Market in Boston, Renaissance Center in Detroit, and Bob will be familiar with Renaissance Center in Detroit. Again, it was built on the riverfront. It was supposed to save downtown and really all of Detroit. Peachtree Place in Atlanta, and I won't go through the list. These are all kind of, there was cheerleading, new construction, redevelopment, arrival of upper income residents downtown. In some cases they had success, but partial success. But again, this Project Savior syndrome and the front stage, backstage metaphor is very strong. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a few conclusions. We have seen this image, or it's images like this a few times now, while Las Vegas. But I want to show you this image. This is also Las Vegas. These are more middle-income neighborhoods. You see single-family homes, golf courses, shopping malls, etc. So I'm trying to look at the relationship between those. And this notion of city as prism. So I like this idea of the prism because it does two things. First of all, it can reflect light back. So it can say, okay, here's what's sort of similar or different between these cities, whether it's Las Vegas and Atlanta, Las Vegas or Stockholm. But also it can provide deeper insights into contemporary urbanism, because prism not only reflects white light, but it breaks down light into its color spectrum, red, yellow, green, blue, and so forth. So you can understand deeper phenomena as well. Now, in terms of Las Vegas, I think what makes it interesting, as several of the speakers have said today, yeah, in some ways it's unique, but it's also similar. But I think because it's so extreme, especially the Strip, etc., actually it embodies complex phenomena that you can dig deeper. And to reach beyond singular narratives that I talked about in the beginning, Las Vegas as fake, Las Vegas as spectacle, Las Vegas as excessive consumption, I really believe you have to do this, engage in fine-grained empirical analysis, actually look at what's actually happening in the ground rather than just speculating. So I think there is a power of this metaphor is to complicate an overly simplistic dichotomy, drawing our attention to relational and symbiotic nature of urbanism and to uneven access to resources and power. So the quality of a neighborhood depends not only what's happening in it, but outside it, by projects and decisions which are taken beyond it. And these three things, relationality, symbiosis, and uneven access, are powerful ways of understanding how cities operate and what to do about the future. And finally, as a kind of summary, I talked about this is kind of a frame to understand what's going on. And the implication for practice for those of us who are really interested in, okay, how do we engage with this? I think the goal is to design radically new narratives, new specialities, and new syndromes that challenge this metaphor and kind of the material extremes of urbanism. Thank you.